It was one of those grey London mornings where the fog clung to the windows like a second curtain, and the sound of hooves echoed dully along Baker Street. I, Dr. John Watson, had taken refuge beside the hearth, reading the Times, while Holmes, eyes closed, fingers steepled, seemed to be meditating. I had learned not to mistake these moments for idleness. The morning had passed in near silence until a sharp knock at the door shattered the calm. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man of curious bearing. He was tall, with silver hair parted down the middle, and a cloak of foreign weave wrapped tightly around his shoulders. He removed his gloves with deliberate care and looked upon us both with eyes that seemed oddly unfocused, as though seeing not the room, but something far beyond it. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice low and precise, "I was told you are the man to see if one fears a crime before it is committed." Holmes opened his eyes. "You are unusual already," he said. "Most come to me after the fact." "I come," the stranger replied, "because something terrible will happen tomorrow." "And I believe I may be the cause." Holmes sat forward, now fully alert. "Your name?" "Call me Mr. Leontes." My true name would distract. Watson raised an eyebrow, but Holmes motioned for him to withhold comment. He gestured to the visitor to sit. "You say something will happen tomorrow. Are you expecting to commit a crime, Mr. Leontes?" "No, but I will be accused of one, of murder, and I shall be innocent." The room held its breath. "Where?" asked Holmes. "At Ebury House, near Chelsea Embankment." "There will be a gathering, 4 guests besides myself. One of them will die. I do not know how, only that it will occur at precisely 10 minutes to 8 in the evening." Watson could not help himself. "How in heaven's name can you know such a thing if you are not involved?" "I saw it." In a vision, Holmes's eyes flickered with the faint amusement he reserved for mediums and mesmerists. "You are a prophet, then?" "I do not claim such a lofty title," Mr. Leontes said. "I am merely sensitive to certain irregularities in time. I have had such visions before, 3 times to be exact. Each one has come to pass." To the minute, Holmes rose and walked to the window, looking out into the fog as though searching for reason among the chimneys. "You understand, Mr. Leontes," he said, turning, "that Scotland Yard would offer you nothing but a cell for this tale. Which is why I came to you. You have a reputation for clarity amid confusion." Holmes regarded him for a long moment. "Who will the victim be?" "I do not know the name. Only the moment of death, and a sound, a glass breaking. That is all." There was silence again, broken only by the ticking of the mantelpiece clock. "Describe the location." "This Ebury House. It belongs to Mr. Edwin Bradshaw, né financier. He is known for hosting intellectual salons, philosophers, spiritualists, statesmen, the like. Tomorrow's gathering includes me, a novelist, a military historian, a professor of logic, and Mr. Bradshaw himself." Holmes nodded slowly. "You will attend as planned?" "Yes. I fear that if I do not, it will still happen. Or worse, I will be blamed for having fled." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I believe you are long overdue for a quiet evening with society's thinkers. Would you care to accompany Mr. Leontes to this event tomorrow?" I opened my mouth to protest, but Holmes raised a finger. "I shall arrive later, uninvited and unnoticed. If our visitor speaks the truth, the crime will need more than constables and coincidence to prevent. If he lies, well, we shall soon find out." Holmes turned back to Leontes. "Until then, say nothing to your host. Proceed as though nothing were amiss. Observe carefully. You, Watson, will carry your revolver." My fingers reflexively touched the pocket of my coat. Leontes rose. "Thank you. I only hope I am mad." "So do I," said Holmes. "For if you are sane, someone will die, and we have less than 24 hours to discover who, how, and why." As our mysterious visitor stepped out into the mist, Holmes returned to the window, his face pensive. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "a murderer foretold, and a vision of death. I do believe we have found our next case." Ebury House stood with stately indifference amid the quiet fog of Chelsea Embankment. its tall windows and symmetrical stone facade reflecting a kind of patrician calm. At precisely 7 o'clock, I, Dr. John Watson, dismounted from a hired cab and approached its front door, the soft clip of my boots muffled by the evening mist. My overcoat was thick, and beneath it, the revolver Holmes had insisted upon felt oddly conspicuous, as though I had brought a pistol to a poetry recital. Mr. Leontes met me just inside the entrance hall. He was dressed formally but without ostentation. Black dinner jacket, crisp collar, and a lapel pin shaped like a crescent moon. He gave me a faint nod. "You came," he said simply. "I am under orders," I replied, trying to sound jovial. "And I have a healthy curiosity when murder is forecast, like the weather." He did not smile. The drawing room was lit with amber sconces and a central chandelier, casting soft warmth on rich tapestries and bookshelves crowded with obscure volumes. Mr. Edwin Bradshaw, the host, stood with the unhurried ease of a man used to commanding attention. Silver-haired and thick-set, he had the rugged face of a boxer tempered by Oxford polish. "Dr. Watson," he greeted me, shaking my hand firmly. "A friend of Mr. Leontes is always welcome. I trust you'll enjoy tonight's discussion. That, I thought, depends very much on how many glasses remain intact by the end of the evening." The other guests trickled in, shortly after. First came Colonel Percival Goring, clean-shaven, with a voice like gravel and a stiffness in posture that betrayed a lifetime of command. He acknowledged me with a nod, but made no effort at conversation. Then Professor Aldous Penworthy, the logician, arrived with a book under his arm and a rather alarming habit of blinking rapidly when spoken to. And finally, Miss Violet Merrow, the novelist, a striking woman in her 30s, with auburn hair and the kind of smile that suggested she was already composing everyone's inner monologues. We gathered around a low table laid with crystal glasses, a decanter of brandy, and a small dish of sugared almonds. Bradshaw presided from an armchair like a magistrate awaiting testimony. "The theme tonight," he announced, "is the nature of foresight, superstition, logic, and the uncomfortable places where they intersect. Mr. Leontes, you have the floor." All heads turned. Leontes rose with a quiet dignity. "Thank you. What I will share may seem fanciful to some, dangerous to others, but I speak only of what I experience. At irregular intervals, I see glimpses, not dreams, not imaginings, but slices of time yet to pass." The reactions were predictable. The colonel gave a grunt of disbelief. The professor leaned forward, intrigued. Miss Merrow tapped a finger to her lips, as if filing it all away for future dialogue. "What precisely do you see?" asked Penworthy, eyes gleaming. "Do you perceive cause or merely effect?" "Only the moment," said Leontes. "A scene, an event, sometimes accompanied by a sound or a peculiar feeling, as though I am there but unseen. Once I saw a child fall from a stepladder 2 days before it happened. Another time, a carriage overturned near Whitechapel. The visions came without warning." Bradshaw raised an eyebrow. "And what proof have you?" "None that would satisfy a court," said Leontes calmly. "But I believe one such moment will occur tonight." That caused the room to still. "What sort of moment?" Miss Merrow asked softly. Leontes hesitated. I could see the strain in his shoulders. "I have foreseen a death. Here, among us. At precisely 10 minutes to 8. A pause. Then the colonel barked a laugh. "You mean to say one of us is about to drop dead?" "I do not know how it happens, only that it does." Bradshaw looked amused, but there was a certain tightness about his mouth. "Well, I dare say that if this turns out to be true, you'll find yourself more famous than any clairvoyant at a séance. Until then, let us proceed with our brandy conversation," resumed, albeit with a curious tension now coloring each remark. Professor Penworthy launched into a philosophical dissection of causality, while Miss Merrow drifted to the fireplace, watching Leontes with the wary fascination of a hawk circling prey. I tried to observe as Holmes would have done, watching hands, expressions, subtle reactions to the prophecy. Colonel Goring remained skeptical and brusque, but his fingers tapped against his glass with mounting impatience. Bradshaw appeared unfazed, yet he poured himself another measure with slightly more force than necessary. Professor Penworthy kept trying to engage Leontes on the metaphysics of premonition, while Miss Merrow grew increasingly quiet, her gaze fixed not on Leontes, but on the clock. 7:43. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, adjusting the revolver in my coat pocket. Holmes had not yet arrived, unless he was already hidden among the guests in some disguise. I scanned the corridor for any sign of him. No violinist, no serving staff in false mustaches, no sign of subterfuge. 7:48. I returned to the drawing room, where the tone had shifted palpably. The guests had fallen into a guarded silence. The decanter stood half empty. The fire crackled on. Then, at exactly 7:49, a sharp sound sliced through the stillness. Glass shattered. Miss Merrow gave a cry. Colonel Goring rose at once. Bradshaw stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. Professor Penworthy had collapsed against the sideboard, eyes wide, mouth agape. He was dead. Leontes did not move. His hands rested neatly on his knees, face composed, as though he had just heard a clock strike an hour he already knew would come. I sprang forward, checking the professor's pulse. Nothing. No visible wound. His expression was frozen in something between awe and disbelief. A brandy glass lay shattered on the carpet. "Fetch help," Bradshaw barked. "My physician is only a block away." As the others scrambled, I could only stare at Leontes, whose eyes now rested calmly on me. "I did warn you," he said softly. Just then, a knock sounded at the door. A familiar voice floated down the hallway. Cool, unbothered. "If no one objects, I'd like to examine the deceased before the body is moved." Sherlock Holmes had arrived. Holmes entered Ebury House with the calm precision of a man already halfway through a solution. He removed his gloves with a flick, handed his coat to a speechless footman, and strode into the drawing room as if he had been expected. He paused briefly at the threshold, taking in the tableau, the overturned chair, the stunned guests, and the lifeless form of Professor Penworthy slumped against the sideboard. His eyes, cool and grey as steel, swept the room with calculated economy. Without a word, he crouched beside the corpse, fingertips pressed together as he observed. "Watson," he said without looking up, "what have we?" I stepped forward, still shaken. "No external trauma." He collapsed after a sound. Glass breaking. The time was 7:49. Holmes reached for Penworthy's wrist, gently turning it over, then lifted the chin and examined the pupils. "No bruising or petechiae," he murmured. "Pallor onset consistent with syncope, but the hands are curious. Note the position." Indeed, Penworthy's fingers were curled inward, almost claw-like, as if frozen mid-grasp. Holmes leaned close to the sideboard and sniffed, then withdrew a folded handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at the lip of a brandy glass. "Do not touch anything further," he warned the others. "Mrs. Hudson would be most cross if we brought poison back to Baker Street on our cuffs." Bradshaw, trying to maintain order, stepped forward. "Mr. Holmes, may I ask how you arrived so quickly?" "I have a fondness for punctuality," Holmes replied dryly. "Besides, when my companion enters a house under the threat of death, I tend to follow close behind." And now, who poured the professor's drink? All eyes turned to the decanter. Colonel Goring cleared his throat. "I did," he said, "for myself and for him. One pour each, no tricks." We all drank. Holmes crossed to the brandy bottle and examined it in the lamplight. He uncorked it and took a cautious whiff. No almond. No laudanum, no clouding. He looked to Watson. Yet something struck down Penworthy without warning or struggle. He turned abruptly to Leontes. "You predicted this." Leontes inclined his head, unshaken. I described the moment. I did not cause it. Holmes approached him slowly, as one might approach a chess opponent preparing a final move. "Your vision included the sound of glass breaking." "It did." Holmes raised a brow. "And yet you chose to remain seated." I feared interfering would ensure the outcome rather than prevent it. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to Miss Merrow. "You screamed." "Why?" She blinked rapidly, hands clasped tightly in front of her. I saw his hand tremble. Then the glass slipped. I thought he was having a seizure, but it wasn't violent. He just collapsed. Holmes nodded, then stepped to the fireplace and retrieved a poker. With a practiced hand, he tapped the remnants of the shattered glass. "Interesting," he murmured. The break occurred not at the rim, but at the base. The stem sheared cleanly. "Watson, you're familiar with certain fast-acting alkaloids, yes?" "Indeed. If one wanted to deliver a poison that kills without a trace in under a minute, how might they do so?" I considered. Digitalis, perhaps. But it's slower. Cyanide would produce a smell. Strychnine causes convulsions. There are rare venoms, neurotoxins, that can cause cardiac arrest almost immediately. Holmes nodded. But how to deliver it, untraceably, in a brandy glass that all had access to? He stepped back and surveyed the guests. "One possibility," he said aloud, "is that the glass was tampered with in advance. Perhaps the inside was coated with something. The question then becomes, how was it introduced without others seeing?" Colonel Goring bristled. "Are you suggesting someone among us is a murderer?" Holmes turned on him sharply. "I suggest nothing. I deduce. You, sir, poured the drink. But did you select the glass?" Goring shook his head. The glasses were already set on the tray. "I picked up 2 at random." Holmes turned to Bradshaw. "Who prepared the tray?" Bradshaw looked uneasy. "My butler, Godfrey, arranged it. He's been with me for 9 years." "I'll want to speak with him," said Holmes. "Immediately." Bradshaw signaled a footman who vanished down the hallway. Holmes turned once more to the room. "In the meantime, none of you is to leave. We are dealing with a death that occurred under impossible circumstances, or so it would seem. That is precisely the sort of circumstance I enjoy." The guests dispersed slightly, drifting to chairs and corners. The colonel stood ramrod straight, glaring at the hearth. Miss Merrow remained near the window, her arms folded tightly. Leontes sat motionless, a portrait of eerie composure. Bradshaw hovered near the drinks cabinet, casting glances at the tray. The butler, Godfrey, entered a few minutes later, a tall, hollow-cheeked man with a slight limp and the downcast gaze of the perpetually blamed. Holmes addressed him briskly. "You arranged the drinks this evening?" "Yes, sir." "Did anyone instruct you on which glass to use for whom?" "No, sir. I set out 6 glasses. I poured no drinks myself." "You handled the glasses with your bare hands?" Godfrey hesitated. "I used a cloth, sir." "As I always do." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Where are the other unused glasses?" "In the kitchen, sir." "Bring them. Carefully. Use gloves." As the butler left, Holmes turned to me with a glint of anticipation. If one of the glasses was treated in advance, the residue may remain. It's a slim chance, but slim chances have favored us before. 10 minutes later, Godfrey returned with 4 untouched brandy glasses resting on a wooden tray. Holmes examined them closely under the lamp, using a small magnifier he produced from his coat. After a few tense minutes, he set the tray down. "One of them shows signs of faint etching on the interior surface. It's possible an acidic compound was applied." Watson leaned in. "Something like hydrofluoric acid?" "Perhaps," Holmes said, "or something more exotic. But the presence of tampering is clear. This was no natural death." A tense silence settled once more. Bradshaw, pale and rigid, cleared his throat. "If what you say is true, then the killer must be among us. No one else had access to that tray between its preparation and the moment the drinks were served." Holmes tilted his head. "Which is precisely why I intend to observe you all very closely over the next few hours." He turned toward the body once more. "And as for you, Professor Penworthy, you may have died too quietly for your own good. But rest assured, the man or woman who saw to your end did not do so without leaving behind a thread." All we must do now is pull it." He straightened and turned toward me. "Watson, send a message to Scotland Yard requesting an officer remain stationed outside. We'll need more than just philosophical debate to keep our guests from vanishing." By the time Inspector Lestrade arrived from Scotland Yard, damp coat, brisk manner, and a face that barely masked irritation, it was well past 9 o'clock. Holmes greeted him with uncharacteristic warmth, which, I suspected, was due less to friendship and more to the strategic advantage of having someone official to hold the leash on the increasingly nervous guests. "Well, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade muttered, surveying the drawing room as the butler served tea to pale faces, "I was told there had been a death under suspicious circumstances. Is that true?" "Entirely," said Holmes. "Professor Aldous Penworthy, logician and guest of Mr. Bradshaw, collapsed and died at precisely 7:49 this evening after sipping from a brandy glass. No visible wounds, no scent of poison. But the glass in question shows signs of chemical etching, and I suspect he was murdered by an agent applied in advance." Lestrade sighed. "So not a heart attack, then?" "If it was," said Holmes, "it was one that was carefully engineered by someone in this very room." Lestrade looked around, eyeing the guests. Goring stared into the fireplace, fists clenched. Miss Merrow sat by the window with her hands still, unusually silent. Bradshaw paced slowly near the bookshelf, while Mr. Leontes remained in a chair apart, his eyes half closed as if in prayer or anticipation. "And these folks all saw it happen?" "They were here," I said. "Whether they saw the truth is another matter." Holmes gestured toward the untouched tray of glasses. I examined the remaining pieces. "One shows signs of having been tampered with, perhaps with a fast-acting neurotoxin or acid-based compound. If that's so, the killer needed time and precision." "And motive," added Lestrade. Holmes nodded. "Yes, motive will be key. We must determine who had reason to wish Penworthy dead." He turned to the assembled guests. "We'll speak with each of you, in private, for your comfort, and to preserve the integrity of your recollections." Bradshaw cleared his throat. "Mr. Holmes, as this occurred in my home, I request to be interviewed last. I have some household matters to manage in the meantime." Holmes agreed without comment. Lestrade pulled out a small notebook, and the questioning began. Colonel Goring was first. He entered the adjoining study with the crisp bearing of a military man still under review. Holmes did not sit. "You knew the deceased well?" "Not intimately," Goring said. "Met him once before at a lecture on military logic and strategy. Thought he was a pedantic bore. But he had his followers. Any disputes between you?" "No more than the usual. I don't take kindly to men who tell soldiers that wars are nothing more than misapplied logic puzzles." "Did you notice anything odd about Penworthy's behavior tonight?" "He was quiet, reserved, seemed nervous, if you ask me. Clutched his brandy glass like it was the last drink before the gallows." Holmes's tone was clipped. "You poured the drink?" "Yes, for him and me. The glasses were already set on the tray." "And you noticed nothing unusual about the glass?" "No, I wasn't looking for poison, Holmes. I was just being polite." Holmes dismissed him, and the colonel left the room with a curt nod. Next came Miss Violet Merrow. She sat delicately, her fingers worrying the edge of her sleeve. "You were near the victim when he collapsed," Holmes began. "Yes," she said, her voice soft. "He was only a few feet away." I saw his hand tremble. The glass dropped, and then he was gone. "Did you notice anything different about his manner?" "He was tense, distracted. He'd brought a book with him, but he never opened it." Holmes leaned forward. "Did he speak to you at all?" "A little. He said he wasn't sure why he had come tonight, that it might be a mistake." "Did he mention Leontes?" At that, her face shifted. "Yes," she whispered. "He said, 'The man who claims to see tomorrow knows too much about yesterday.' Then he asked if I believed in prophecy." Holmes arched an eyebrow but said nothing more. He made a brief note and excused her. Third was Mr. Leontes. He entered with the grace of a clergyman and stood rather than sit. You foresaw this moment, Holmes said coldly, yet you did nothing to prevent it. I did not know who would die, Leontes said, only that someone would. I feared that any interference might lead to worse. You must understand how convenient your knowledge appears. I do. Have you had visions of murder before? Only once. Years ago. I failed to speak and the victim died as I foresaw. Who was the victim? Leontes hesitated. My wife. There was a pause. Holmes softened ever so slightly. You believe yourself cursed? No, merely burdened and penworthy. Did you know him previously? I had encountered his writings. Never met him in person until tonight. Did you speak? Briefly. He called me a charlatan. Said I was dangerous to rational thought. I agreed with him. Holmes allowed him to leave. Lastly, we summoned Mr. Edwin Bradshaw, the host. He entered slowly, shoulders tight. Mr. Holmes, he began, I hope this will not ruin the reputation of my home. I've hosted dozens of intellectual evenings, never anything of this nature. Mr. Bradshaw, Holmes said coolly, how well did you know Professor Penworthy? Quite well. He was a regular guest. We shared a fondness for logic and debate. His opinions were strong, but he was never cruel. Any quarrels recently? Bradshaw looked away. Nothing public, but he did raise objections to Leontes being invited tonight. Why? He felt the man was a fraud. That giving him a platform lent credence to superstition. Did you agree? Bradshaw hesitated. I thought it would spark lively discussion. Holmes studied him. You said you had household matters to tend to earlier. What, precisely? I dismissed the kitchen staff. They were becoming anxious. I also instructed Godfrey to lock the liquor cabinet. Why? I don't know. Just a precaution. Something about tonight felt off. Holmes made no comment, only a long, measuring stare. When Bradshaw left, Holmes turned to Lestrade and me. We now know 3 things, he said. First, Penworthy feared something tonight. Perhaps not death itself, but exposure. Second, our prophet Leontes may not be lying, but his visions are a dangerous convenience. And third, he trailed off, eyes narrowing toward the shattered remnants of the brandy glass still resting on a silver tray. Third, I prompted. Someone here, he said, intended that specific glass to reach a specific person, which means the killer planned for the victim to be Penworthy all along. But that requires either manipulation or foreknowledge. He turned toward the door, eyes shining with sudden energy. Watson, Lestrade, we must search Penworthy's coat, his briefcase, anything he brought with him. I suspect he carried more than a book to this gathering. Something worth killing for Holmes, swept from the drawing room with the urgency of a man who had just glimpsed the edge of the puzzle's lid. Lestrade and I followed in silence, our footsteps echoing faintly down the corridor as the hush of Ebury House settled behind us once more. Holmes paused only briefly to speak with Godfrey, instructing the butler to lead us to where Professor Penworthy's belongings had been stored. The guest cloakroom was narrow and dim, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and aged wood polish. A row of heavy coats hung along one wall, and beneath them, a small bench bore Penworthy's dark leather briefcase. Holmes crouched beside it, fingers brushing lightly over the worn handle before he lifted it and placed it on the bench. Locked, he murmured, and produced from his coat a small leather roll of tools, slim picks and files more suited to a locksmith than a detective. Within moments, the latch gave way with a soft click. The briefcase contained little at first glance. A clean handkerchief, a few correspondence cards, a monograph on deductive paradoxes, and a tightly bound leather notebook, old, almost brittle. Holmes handled it with care, glancing over the first page before snapping the book shut again. This, he said, is not idle philosophy. What is it? Lestrade asked, leaning in. A manuscript. Not a published work, I suspect. Perhaps an unfinished one. See here, the spine is marked only with the letter E. I'd wager this is a private treatise, one the professor never intended for public reading, at least not yet. Holmes opened the book again, carefully scanning the pages, turning slowly. His eyes flickered with increasing interest as he read, until at last he let out a low whistle and shut the book a second time. "Well," he muttered, "this may explain why he died before he could say too much." Lestrade bristled. "What are you implying? That the contents of this book contain either a secret, a revelation, or an accusation, and that someone at the gathering knew it would soon come to light?" He handed me the notebook. "Watson, your medical Latin will serve us here. Skim it, don't read every word, but tell me the nature of the writing." I began turning the pages. The handwriting was precise but spidery and dense with notations. As I progressed, my brow furrowed. "This isn't just abstract theory," I said. "He's examining patterns of behavior, almost like case studies. Here, this one refers to a man who believes he can predict the future. Subject exhibits acute psychological rigidity, claims foresight, but manifests reaction to events only after public occurrences." That sounds very much like Mr. Leontes. Holmes's expression grew sharp. "Go on." "Another entry discusses a financier who masks ethical failings beneath social charm, and here, one about a military man whose strategies hinge on binary logic, devoid of moral nuance. Holmes, these are our guests," Lestrade swore under his breath. Holmes nodded grimly. Penworthy wasn't merely writing philosophy. He was conducting psychological dissections of the people he knew. Possibly of everyone in that room. Lestrade crossed his arms. "Then one of them killed him to keep that notebook from ever seeing daylight." "More likely," said Holmes. "Someone learned of it earlier this evening and took swift action." We returned to the drawing room, the mood chillier now, eyes darting toward the briefcase in Holmes's hand. Holmes stood before the fireplace, letting the lamplight gleam across the notebook's worn cover. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "Professor Penworthy brought with him tonight a private manuscript. A document containing rather pointed commentary, one might say character profiles, on individuals strikingly similar to those gathered here." There was a shift in the room, minute but palpable. Holmes continued, "He did not name names directly, but the descriptions are unmistakable. That alone may not constitute a motive, but consider this. What if the professor had intended to read from these pages tonight? What if he meant to confront someone?" Bradshaw stepped forward, eyes flashing. "You're saying one of us silenced him?" "I am saying," Holmes said evenly, "that the opportunity, the means, and now the motive are present in this room." The silence that followed was electric. Miss Merrow broke it. "May I see the pages?" "No," said Holmes, with a gentleness that belied his firmness. "Not yet." I must first confirm a suspicion. He turned to Lestrade. "I need access to Penworthy's correspondence. And I would like to know whether he left copies of this manuscript elsewhere. A publisher, a solicitor, a university. Someone must have known." Lestrade gave a tight nod. "I'll see what I can do. Until then," Holmes continued, "no one is to leave this house. Watson, stay with them. Keep your ears open." "And you?" I asked. "I'm going to visit Penworthy's lodgings." "Alone. Something tells me our professor left more than just thoughts behind." Bradshaw frowned. "You're leaving now?" "It's nearly midnight." "The hour does not dissuade me," Holmes replied, already collecting his coat and scarf. "When time is the enemy, delay becomes an accomplice." He swept from the room, the briefcase under his arm, leaving the fire to crackle and the rest of us to stew in a silence broken only by the wind against the windows. I took a seat beside the hearth, watching each of the guests closely. Goring had resumed his position by the fire, stiff and unreadable. Miss Merrow scribbled something in a small notebook she had produced from her handbag. Perhaps instinctive, or perhaps something else. Bradshaw poured himself another glass of brandy with a trembling hand. And Leontes simply watched the flames, as if awaiting a moment he'd already seen. It was then that a thought struck me, a simple one, yet chilling. If Leontes had foreseen the murder precisely and truly could not prevent it, had he also foreseen the aftermath? And if so, What else did he already know? Holmes stepped out into the cold night with the briefcase tucked beneath his arm like a relic freshly unearthed from some forgotten tomb. The streets of Chelsea were damp and dimly lit, fog swirling in low coils as if drawn by the very scent of mystery. He hailed no cab but walked briskly, his long stride devouring the cobbled pavement. The address he had retrieved from Penworthy's calling card led him to Grafton Street, a quiet row of dignified residences just west of Hanover Square. Number 17 was unremarkable. A narrow townhouse with soot-darkened brick and lace curtains drawn against the night. A brass plate near the door read, Dr. Aldous Penworthy, visiting fellow in logic and epistemology. Holmes rapped twice with the knuckle of his gloved hand. After a moment, the door creaked open and a thin, stooped woman peered out, candle in hand. Yes? Good evening. My name is Sherlock Holmes. I regret to inform you that Dr. Penworthy has died. I must examine his study. The woman blanched, but nodded wordlessly. I'm Mrs. Thistle, his housekeeper. This way. So she led him up a narrow staircase to the first floor. Holmes noted that the place was meticulously kept. No dust on the railings, no clutter in the hall. Penworthy had lived with the rigid precision of a man who trusted order more than instinct. Mrs. Thistle opened the door to the study and stepped back. He said if anything ever happened, someone might come. He didn't say who, but he asked me not to interfere. You've done well, Holmes said simply. She closed the door behind him and he stood alone in the darkened chamber. The study was a scholar's haven, books shelved to the ceiling, maps of ancient logic trees on the wall, and a green-shaded desk lamp beside an untouched inkwell. Holmes crossed to the desk and opened the top drawer. Notebooks, all neatly labeled by date. He removed one, flicked through it, then set it aside. Too early. He searched for something more recent. The third notebook revealed something. The handwriting was the same as in the volume he had found earlier at Ebury House. Tight, methodical, unemotional. But these pages included names. Goring, Bradshaw, Merrow, and even Leontes. Holmes sat down and began to read. Penworthy had been writing a private profile on the psychological underpinnings of prophecy. More specifically, on men like Leontes. He referred to his subject as the temporal savant and argued that such individuals were not seers but highly observant minds who constructed predictive patterns so well disguised that even they believed them to be visions. He does not know how he knows. That is the danger. He believes in magic, where there is only subconscious reasoning. And the moment he is challenged, the prophecy may become protection or a weapon. Holmes set the notebook down, fingers steepled. Penworthy had suspected Leontes of being something between a brilliant analyst and a dangerously deluded man. Not a fraud, but a man trapped by his own powers of deduction, cloaked in mysticism. He turned to the next page. It was a letter, unsigned, unsent, perhaps never meant to be posted. But it had been carefully written. To whom it may concern, if I am silenced, I urge you to look not for blood on hands, but for silence in words. The person who knows will not speak. The person who fears discovery will drown in courtesy. I know now that my presence at Ebury House is no accident. I'm being drawn into something not of my making. My enemy will not stab, they will smile, they will toast my name, and then I shall die. Holmes closed the book. Someone invited him to his own murder, he murmured. He stood, replacing the notebook inside the briefcase. Then he turned to the bookshelf, running his hand along the spines. One caught his eye, not for its title but for its angle. Slightly askew. He pulled it. Behind it lay a shallow compartment, cleverly concealed, no thicker than a folio. Inside were 3 envelopes, bound with twine. The first was addressed to a solicitor in Gray's Inn. The second was marked to be opened in the event of my death. The third was unmarked. Holmes opened the unmarked one. Inside, a single sheet of thick stationery. On it, Penworthy had written in a firm, deliberate hand, I know what you've done, Edwin, and I will not be quiet any longer." Holmes exhaled through his nose, eyes sharp. Bradshaw, the respectable financier. The smiling host, the man who had arranged the seating, invited Leontes and insisted the professor be included despite protest. The man who had, until now, remained just outside the line of suspicion. Holmes returned everything to the briefcase. He descended the stairs to find Mrs. Thistle waiting in the hallway, shawl around her shoulders. "Thank you, madam," he said. "You've been most helpful." Was he afraid, sir?" she asked in a whisper. Holmes paused at the threshold. "Not afraid. Just aware. He saw the end coming, not in a vision, but in logic. That, I think, frightened him more. With that, he stepped back into the fog. By the time he returned to Ebury House, it was nearly 2 in the morning. The drawing-room lights were dimmed, but the fire still burned. Lestrade looked up from an armchair with bloodshot eyes. Watson sat across from Miss Merrow, who had not slept. Colonel Goring had gone to the upstairs guest room under Lestrade's watchful instructions, and Bradshaw, Holmes noted, was pacing slowly by the window, pretending not to look relieved by Holmes's return. Without a word, Holmes handed the briefcase to Watson. "Lock it in the study. No one is to touch it." Then he turned to the room. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall speak plainly. Tonight we let truth settle like ash after a fire." He walked to the fireplace, stared into the flames, and whispered, almost to himself, "One man sees the future. Another tries to bury the past. And in between, a dead philosopher saw them both for what they were." Morning brought no clarity, only a grayer shade of uncertainty. The fog still clung to the windows of Ebury House like a silent witness refusing to leave the scene of the crime. Holmes had slept only briefly, if at all. I had found him before dawn, standing alone in the drawing-room, staring not at the remnants of the shattered brandy glass still cordoned off on its tray, but at the armchair where Penworthy had once sat. Now empty, but not yet forgotten. Lestrade arrived shortly after 9, a cup of lukewarm tea in one hand and a list of background information in the other. "I had a man go through Penworthy's letters and professional connections," he said, "clean as a whistle. No enemies on record, no debts, no mistresses, no signs of scandal, though there's one letter of interest, dated 3 weeks ago. It was sent to Edwin Bradshaw Holmes, perked slightly." "And?" "A polite refusal. Bradshaw had invited him to speak at a private gathering. Penworthy declined, citing an ethical incompatibility with one of the other guests." Holmes nodded slowly. "Did he specify which guest?" "No. But the date matches the first time Leontes was announced to be present at one of Bradshaw's salons." I frowned. So Penworthy refused. "Yet last night he came." Holmes looked up from the hearth. "Because someone changed his mind." Bradshaw was summoned to the study. He entered with a confidence that had not entirely eroded, though the corners of his mouth were drawn tighter than before. Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Bradshaw, I'd like you to recall for me precisely how the invitation list for last night's gathering came to be." Bradshaw folded his hands. "As with all my events, I began with a theme. This time, the nature of foresight. I thought it would be engaging to juxtapose the scientific with the spiritual. Hence, Professor Penworthy and Mr. Leontes. Professor Penworthy declined initially. Yes, but I appealed to him. I said he could consider it a debate, not a fellowship. He relented. I assumed he was coming in good faith. Was there tension between them before last night?" Bradshaw hesitated. "I wouldn't call it personal." Penworthy had dismissed Leontes publicly, wrote a review last year condemning prophetic reasoning as the intellectual mask of emotional disorder. Leontes didn't respond. "Did you think hosting them together was wise?" "I thought it would be civil." "We're not children," Holmes tilted his head. "And yet one is dead, and the other has predicted it down to the minute Bradshaw tensed. Do you believe Leontes capable of murder?" "I believe him capable of persuasion," Holmes said, "and I believe that persuasion may not be benign." Bradshaw rose. If you're implying I bear guilt for fostering a dangerous discussion, Holmes interrupted sharply. I'm implying nothing. I am, however, questioning the integrity of your neutrality. Bradshaw blinked. Holmes continued, his voice cold. You received a second letter from Penworthy the day before yesterday. A private one. He confronted you about something, didn't he? Bradshaw's face went still. I don't know what you're referring to. Holmes opened the briefcase on the table and removed the single page he had discovered behind Penworthy's bookshelf. I do. He laid it flat. Bradshaw stared at the bold handwriting. I know what you've done, Edwin. And I will not be quiet any longer. Silence swelled in the room. Bradshaw exhaled slowly. It was a misunderstanding. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Enlighten me. I invested in a company that Penworthy had previously denounced as unethical. A pharmaceutical syndicate is testing experimental compounds overseas. He believed it violated human dignity. And did it? Bradshaw looked away. It was legal. Which is not the same thing. Holmes leaned forward. Penworthy threatened to expose you. He said he'd written about it. Said he'd identified me in a case study. He didn't say when or where it would be published. But it was here. Holmes tapped the manuscript. In this notebook. Bradshaw's voice tightened. I didn't kill him. I never said you did. Bradshaw turned and walked out of the room, shoulders braced like a man awaiting judgment. Holmes remained seated, the page still before him. I finally spoke. You pushed him. I needed the crack to show, Holmes replied. Bradshaw feared exposure, but I don't think he poured that drink. Then who? Holmes tapped his fingers against the edge of the chair. Who benefits from chaos? Who survives scrutiny by becoming its messenger? We both turned at the sound of footsteps. Leontes. He entered quietly, as if summoned by the very gravity of our thoughts. Holmes looked up. Mr. Leontes. Sit. Leontes obeyed, folding his hands neatly in his lap. You saw the death. Predicted the moment. Knew the sound. But did you ever wonder whether you truly saw it, or simply ensured it would happen? Leontes did not blink. I told you the truth as I knew it. You told us the truth after it happened. No, I told you the truth before, and you chose not to believe. Holmes's voice sharpened. Did you want it to happen? No, but you let it. I believed I had no power to stop it. Holmes rose. You are not a prophet. You are a savant, a man whose mind calculates patterns before he knows he's observing them, but that makes you dangerous, because you believe you are outside causality, when in fact you are deep within it. Leontes stood slowly. Then I am no different from you, Mr. Holmes, except that you call it deduction, and I call it destiny. The door closed behind him. Lestrade entered moments later with an update. No fingerprints on the glass. The acid, if it was acid, has dissolved most residue. The brandy was clean. No sign of a delivery mechanism. It's like the poison was part of the glass itself. Holmes stared at the empty chair where Leontes had sat. I suspect the killer wore gloves, he said quietly. I also suspect we've all been drinking from the same tray, but only one glass had been coated from within. A substitution. Deliberate. Lestrade rubbed his temples. We need more than guesswork. We need the toast, Holmes said suddenly. What? Last night, before Penworthy died. There was a toast. I nodded slowly. Yes. Bradshaw raised his glass. Holmes looked at me. And who handed the glass to Penworthy? I froze. Colonel Goring poured it, but who gave it to him? Neither of us could recall. Holmes's eyes narrowed. There was a moment. Just before. A smile. A clink. A sleight of hand, perhaps. Someone who knew that the right gesture in the right moment would place the right glass in the right hand. Someone, he whispered, who knew exactly how the moment would unfold. By midday, the clouds above London hung as low as the mood inside Ebury House. There was a certain tension in the drawing room, a fragile equilibrium that only Holmes seemed to navigate without effort. The guests had remained inside at Lestrade's insistence, each cloaked in their own brand of discomfort. Miss Merrow stared out the window, sketching something furiously in her notebook. Goring paced, arms folded behind his back. Bradshaw spoke only when spoken to, and Leontes, as ever, appeared eerily composed. Holmes stood at the sideboard, arms crossed, his attention fixed on the silver tray and its sad arrangement of brandy glasses. The shattered one had been removed for analysis, but the others sat where Godfrey had first replaced them, undisturbed since the night before. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, "the geometry of guilt." I joined him, noting his eyes weren't on the glasses themselves, but on the faint, irregular circle left by condensation near the center of the tray. "One glass stood here," Holmes said, pointing. "It was moved at the last minute." "Why?" Lestrade, who had just returned from the yard's messenger station, stepped in. "Still no results from the lab." "But we've ruled out anything in the brandy itself. It's what you said, Holmes. The glass was tainted, not the contents." Holmes nodded. "Then the question is, who knew which glass was which? Who had reason to ensure one specific guest received the poisoned one?" I offered the logical path. The butler laid out the glasses. Colonel Goring poured. But in the flurry of the toast, glasses were passed hand to hand. Holmes knelt by the tray, his expression unreadable. "No, Watson. The answer isn't in who poured. It's in who arranged." He stood and turned toward the others. "Miss Merrow," he called, "a moment, if you would." She looked up from her notebook, hesitating before walking over. Holmes offered her a small bow. "Last evening, before the toast, I believe you were seated closest to the tray." "I suppose so," she said cautiously. "Did you touch the glasses?" She blinked. Yes. Only briefly. Godfrey brought in the tray, but there was confusion. Bradshaw was speaking and the others hadn't moved. I handed a glass to Colonel Goring first, then to whom? I don't recall. I think Mr. Leontes, then the professor, and then Bradshaw took the last one. Holmes gave a faint smile. "And your own?" I waited. I thought I might skip the drink entirely. "Did you?" "No," she admitted. Bradshaw insisted. Holmes tilted his head. "So you touched them all?" "I suppose. But only briefly. I didn't know which was which." "That," said Holmes, "is precisely the point." He turned to the group. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe the arrangement of the glasses was no accident. Nor was the toast a mere formality. It was a stage, a scene choreographed with subtle but deadly intent." Colonel Goring stepped forward. "You think the killer switched the poisoned glass during the toast?" "No," Holmes replied. "I think the killer designed the event so the glass would reach its target without ever being switched. The killer arranged for Penworthy to receive the only poisoned glass by controlling the order in which they were handed out." Bradshaw frowned. "That would require incredible timing." "Yes," Holmes said, "or foreknowledge." He let the words hang in the air. Leontes, seated calmly in the armchair by the fire, looked up. "You suspect me again." Holmes approached him slowly. "You said the death would occur at 7:49. You were right, but your description included a broken glass and a precise moment of collapse." Leontes nodded. Holmes continued. "You arrived early. You took your seat before the others. You positioned yourself nearest the tray. Coincidence?" "No," Holmes said softly. "Design." He looked to Lestrade. "Send a man to search Mr. Leontes's lodgings. Have them look for glass etching tools, gloves, or chemical agents that could have been used to coat a drinking vessel." Leontes tilted his head, as if studying Holmes from another century. "You're making an error, Mr. Holmes." "Am I? You're assuming I'm the architect of a future I merely glimpsed." Holmes raised a brow. "Or you glimpsed nothing and orchestrated everything." Leontes stood now, slowly, his hands loose at his sides. "You believe I engineered the event to fulfill the vision?" "I believe," Holmes said evenly, "that you used the illusion of prophecy to shield the reality of planning. You positioned yourself as both messenger and bystander. If the murder failed, you would be eccentric. If it succeeded, you would be vindicated. Either way, suspicion would seem illogical, because who suspects a man who already told them exactly what would happen? Leontes said nothing. But one detail betrays you, Holmes added. You described the sound of the glass breaking before it shattered. You claimed to have seen the moment. Yet your seating, your calmness, your refusal to intervene betray not clairvoyance, but orchestration. Leontes' eyes glimmered. You mistake my detachment for guilt. No, Holmes replied, voice low. I recognize it. It's the detachment of a man who thinks he's above cause and effect, but you are not. The silence that followed was leaden. No one moved. Finally, Miss Merrow spoke. But why would he kill Penworthy? Holmes looked toward her. Because Penworthy saw through him. The manuscript details his analysis of Leontes, not as a mystic, but as a savant hiding his genius behind visions. And worse, he planned to expose it. Leontes turned away now, staring into the fire. He would have ruined me. You ruined yourself, Holmes said softly. Lestrade stepped forward. Mr. Leontes, I must ask you to remain here while we complete our search. Leontes did not resist. I won't flee. That wouldn't fit. Holmes returned to the tray, staring at the remaining glasses. One poisoned glass. One intended victim. One man who stood outside the pattern because he wrote it. As Lestrade left to dispatch the search team, Holmes looked to me. There is one test left. What's that? He picked up one of the untouched glasses and held it to the light, the simplest clue of all. Not the poison, not the tray, but the fingerprints are beneath the base. I stepped forward. Why the base? Because the killer never wanted to touch the rim. Holmes smiled, then turned toward Leontes once more. I wonder, Mr. Leontes, can you see your future now? The arrival of the constables from Scotland Yard an hour later brought with it a fresh stir of boots, questions, and leather-bound notepads. Inspector Lestrade returned with 2 officers and a sealed envelope bearing news from the team dispatched to search Mr. Leontes' rooms. Holmes accepted the envelope without ceremony and opened it with the letter opener that still sat beside Penworthy's untouched place at the sideboard. He read it silently, then passed it to me without a word. Inside, the message was clear and brief. Small file located hidden in desk drawer. Label smudged, but trace analysis confirms presence of solanum alkaloids. Identified compound matches a derivative of Atropa belladonna. Nightshade. Notes recovered indicate experimentation with dose thresholds and chemical delivery through silica etching. More items consistent with controlled poisoning were also located. Gloves, file, glass fragments, all tagged and en route. I looked up to find Holmes already pacing again, hands behind his back, eyes sharp. The method, he said, was as elegant as it was sinister. Lestrade frowned. Nightshade. Isn't that a bit medieval? Only in reputation, Holmes replied. In truth, Atropa belladonna is one of the more complex poisons known to man. Even minute doses can disrupt the parasympathetic nervous system. In the right form, introduced via a surface contact, say the lip of a drinking vessel, it produces death by cardiac arrest with few observable signs. Lestrade nodded, grim-faced. And the tools to apply it? Holmes tapped the side of his head. Filed interior glass, prepared days in advance. The killer etched a pattern inside the bowl of one glass, then coated the grooves with a concentrated tincture. The alcohol in the brandy served as a mild activator, encouraging absorption through the lips. He turned, facing the silent gathering. It was precise. Cold. And impossible, too. Detect without foreknowledge, Leontes, seated quietly by the fire, once again, looked neither anxious nor triumphant. He regarded Holmes with something like sorrow, or perhaps disdain. Holmes stepped closer to him. I presume you calculated the dose based on Penworthy's weight. His likely rate of sip. The average duration of a toast. Leontes responded without flinching. I did no such thing. You did. Because it worked silence. Miss Merrow, who had watched the exchange in stillness, suddenly spoke. "May I ask something?" Holmes turned to her. "Of course. If Mr. Leontes planned it all, the poisoning, the manipulation, the prediction, what does the notebook mean to him? Why not destroy it? Why leave behind a document that connects him to the victim?" Holmes offered a faint smile. "Because it suited his mythology. Leontes wanted to be seen, to be right. Penworthy's death was the stage. The notebook was the applause. He didn't want to erase the professor. He wanted to outlive him." Miss Merrow glanced toward Leontes with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "And if no one believed the prophecy, then he would fade into obscurity," Holmes said, "which to a man like him would be worse than arrest." Bradshaw stood now, his voice tense. "But there's still the matter of motive. Leontes and Penworthy disagreed, yes, but is that enough to justify murder?" Holmes turned slowly. "No, not disagreement. Exposure. Penworthy was no fool. He understood that Leontes's predictions were not mystical, but the result of unconscious pattern analysis. An extraordinary mind pretending to see the future when in fact it saw the present more clearly than most. Penworthy intended to expose him publicly, and Leontes knew it. Holmes retrieved the original notebook from the locked cabinet where Lestrade had placed it. "I have read every word," he said. "Every passage, every analogy, and there's one note toward the end. A passage overlooked by all but its intended reader. He opened the final pages and read aloud, 'Subject L believes he is a prophet, but is in truth the most dangerous of liars. One who lies to himself. He orchestrates events with a subtle hand, then convinces others he merely foresaw them. But beneath his detachment is pride. Pride will make him careless. And in that carelessness, I shall write my final truth.'" Holmes closed the notebook and looked directly at Leontes. "You knew he had written it. And that, Mr. Leontes, is why you couldn't allow him to live." For the first time, a flicker of emotion broke through Leontes' stoic facade. His lips parted, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than before. He misunderstood." "How so?" "I didn't want to be believed. I wanted to be wrong, for once. To see the future and have it not come true." "And yet," Holmes said, "you took no step to prevent it." Leontes lowered his eyes. "Because I feared what it would prove. If I failed to stop it, then I was a fraud. But if I let it happen, you were validated," Holmes finished. A long pause settled in the room, heavy as velvet. Lestrade gestured to the officers. "Take him." As they stepped forward, Leontes stood slowly. He didn't resist, but as he passed Holmes, he paused. "There are still things you don't understand," he said. "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "But I solve crimes, Mr. Leontes, not fate." With that, Leontes was led out, the soft click of the door marking his exit as final. I sat down heavily, watching the fire crackle. "You believe he truly thought he was a prophet?" I asked. Holmes sat opposite me, fingers steepled once more. "I believe he believed it, and that is the most dangerous belief of all, the kind that begins with brilliance and ends with tragedy." Bradshaw rose to pour himself a brandy, though none of us touched the tray. Miss Merrow quietly closed her notebook. Even Goring, gruff and unshaken, remained by the window, hands clasped tightly behind his back. Holmes stared into the flames. "In the end," he said, "Penworthy was right. The man who knew tomorrow was really just a man who manipulated today." By the following morning, Ebury House had shed its air of anticipation and intellectual glamour, replaced by the sober silence of the aftermath. Gone were the murmured debates and toasts. The drawing-room no longer smelled of brandy and pipe smoke, but of old wood, coal ash, and quiet regret. The murder had receded into the walls, but not into forgetfulness. Lestrade had taken Leontes into custody just before dawn, with a carriage rolling off into the pale mist of London like some spectral confessional. Now only Holmes, I, and the remnants of the household remained. Colonel Goring had left with little more than a gruff handshake, and Miss Merrow had quietly excused herself, offering Holmes a folded page torn from her notebook. Some parting insight, though he had not yet shared it with me. Holmes stood by the fire, the infamous notebook still in his hands. His fingers traced the edge of the leather binding not with affection, but as one might run a hand over a blade now dulled and set aside. "There's something that still troubles me, Watson," he murmured, not looking up. I glanced up from where I had been examining the glass tray again. "Only one thing?" Holmes offered a faint smile. "At least one I cannot yet account for in full." I set down the tray and joined him. Leontes' guilt is no longer in question. The file in his desk, the preparation, the psychological motive. It's all sound. Oh, quite. And yet, he tapped the cover of Penworthy's notebook. There is an ambiguity that resists even my scrutiny. Which is? He opened the notebook to the final passage, that same chilling line Penworthy had written days before his death. "My enemy will not stab. They will smile. They will toast my name, and then I shall die." "He didn't name Leontes," I said. "No," Holmes said, "he didn't." We stood in silence for a moment. Then Holmes continued, almost to himself. What if, however unlikely, Leontes was not acting alone? What if he was manipulated into believing his vision had to come true? I blinked. "You mean someone used Leontes' delusion against him?" "Consider this," Holmes said, pacing slowly. "Leontes did not approach us seeking escape or anonymity. He announced the murder ahead of time. In effect, he warned us he was playing a long game. Or, Holmes said, he was played. Suppose someone understood the nature of Leontes' so-called foresight, his subconscious analysis, his obsessive need to be correct, and fed him the ingredients of a murder he would believe he had seen. I felt a chill. "You suspect someone planted the idea?" Holmes nodded. "Bradshaw." The name landed with the weight of possibility. He had access. He had a motive. Penworthy's notebook contained not only criticism, it contained direct condemnation of Bradshaw's financial dealings. It would have destroyed him. And unlike Leontes, Bradshaw is a man of influence, reputation, and quiet ruthlessness. But Leontes prepared the poisoned glass. He had the tools, the compound. "Yes," Holmes said. "But what if Bradshaw knew he would? What if Bradshaw suggested, offhandedly, that Penworthy might drink from a particular glass, or hinted to Leontes when and how the moment would occur? A single conversation, a gentle nudge, and the prophecy fulfills itself. Bradshaw keeps his hands clean. Leontes takes the fall." I stared at the fire. "Can we prove it?" Holmes sighed. "Not easily." The manipulation was psychological, but perhaps. He reached into his coat and retrieved the folded page Miss Merrow had left behind. He opened it carefully, then smiled faintly. "It seems Miss Merrow noticed more than she let on." He handed me the page. It was a sketch, a recreation of the moment just before the toast. In her elegant hand, she had drawn each figure precisely in position, Goring with his glass mid-air, Penworthy leaning forward, Leontes seated, and Bradshaw, Holmes pointed. "Do you see?" I nodded slowly. Bradshaw's hand was guiding Penworthy's glass, ever so slightly, across the tray. In the chaos of raised voices and distracted chatter, it would have seemed harmless. Generous, even. A host assisting his guest. But in that moment, the poisoned glass was passed deliberately. "Miss Merrow saw it," I said. "She did," Holmes said, "and chose not to intervene. Perhaps from fear, perhaps from curiosity. Or perhaps she believed the truth would come to light in time." Lestrade returned an hour later to report Leontes' confession had been recorded in full. He claims full responsibility. He swore he acted alone. Showed no sign of coercion. Holmes nodded. He believes it. "That doesn't make it true." Lestrade raised a brow. "You suspect someone else?" I suspect someone wiser than the prophet. Someone who saw how to turn belief into a weapon. Lestrade shook his head. We'll need more than sketches and guesses. Of course, Holmes said lightly. You pursue what can be proven. I will pursue what can be understood. After Lestrade departed, Holmes and I prepared to leave Ebury House. As we descended the steps, I turned to him. Do you think Bradshaw will get away with it? For now, Holmes said. But men like him do not sleep easily. He engineered the crime not with poison, but with silence. And silence, Watson, has a way of cracking when least expected. We walked into the London mist, the final pages of Penworthy's manuscript tucked inside Holmes's coat. The fog swallowed our footsteps as the city moved on, unaware that prophecy had been broken, not by fate, but by logic, pride, and the terrible power of suggestion. And in that balance, I realized, Holmes had once again proved his genius. Not by unraveling a vision of the future, but by seeing with perfect clarity the darkness of the present